Good afternoon. I wanted to stop by. I'm hoping, frankly, to make this an annual visit. I realize that while neither chamber is in session this week, I certainly don't want the people of Pennsylvania to think that we're not busily trying to effectuate what is the most important objective of our time here in Harrisburg, and that is the annual budget and the annual budget process. I'm here to answer any questions on what you may have on your mind relative to that process. I would say that while conversations are ongoing and conversations are quite cordial, I am concerned that the productivity of those conversations is not quite to the level that they need to be to effectuate a budget on time on June 30th. I think there is still an opportunity for us to achieve a June 30th deadline or close to that. But I would say that the pace of conversation and the pace of movement really needs to pick up in short order if that's going to be the case. So with that, happy to entertain any questions.
So what are the biggest pieces that are stalling the talks?
Well, I think the biggest pieces that are stalling the talks are those that we've often discussed, which is one, education funding, two, the overall demand on the budget lines as it relates in particular to human services. I would point out that state government is not immune to the impacts of inflation. We consistently hear from provider groups, particularly in the healthcare field, that they're really struggling to have a labor force available to meet the demands of the services that they provide. And that's a real challenge. And that's an area that I don't think is of partisan nature, but it is a very, very significant pressure on our overall budget. But obviously the education piece is very important. We all know what occurred last year. We were very proud of the bipartisan work that we undertook with the governor to achieve a mutual objective, which is empowering parents. Obviously, we all know that that objective was not successful last year. But the reality is that that effort last year has certainly set expectations within our caucus that empowering parents needs to be a key part of this conversation relative to the expectations of additional funding in the public education space.
Who are you negotiating with right now?
Well, we're in constant talks, in particular with the leadership of the House Democrats and also Governor Shapiro himself and his team. But we're in communication with all four caucuses as we communicate regularly, either at the staff level or the member level.
What's the plan right now? Is it for the House and Senate to come to an agreement and then present it to the governor, or just you're all working together?
Well, our main objective has been that we've made it clear to both the governor and his House Democratic majority that they have to be speaking in unison. That we need to understand that they themselves are on the same page as it relates to their priorities, their response to our priorities. And to me, that's the absolute key to making sure that this process is successful.
You talked about education, you mentioned a couple of times. One specific piece in his education proposal is a new spend of $300 million on environmental repairs for schools. Can you speak about that specifically, your feelings, your caucus feelings?
Well, I think we demonstrated an interest in that issue last year. We allocated significant resources to school facilities repairs, and environmental repairs is a piece of that. And I think in the world of broad education conversations and investment in education, additional support for school facilities is a piece of the equation we're open to entertaining.
Are you, can you say anything about the talk that's happened in this building in the last, maybe not necessarily this session, about the return of PlanCon?
PlanCon is a bureaucratic disaster. I've experienced that over the years that I've been in this building. Anything that is remotely like PlanCon should not be considered because the bureaucracy of that was frankly untenable. And even though we've had a moratorium on PlanCon for several years now, we're still paying that bill. So it cannot be a PlanCon type discussion.
Are there pieces of legislation that you personally oppose or that your caucus personally opposes that you'd be willing to advance in the name of a deal? Say adult use cannabis or minimum wage hike. What's your position on that?
Well, our focus really is on the dollars and cents of a responsible budget. I would say that on adult use cannabis, I do find it interesting, while there's a number of proposals on that issue in the House, we have yet to see the House reach a critical mass to send us any type of a product as it relates to that issue. On minimum wage, I think I've been very consistent over the last 18 months that we have been willing and open to a conversation on a reasonable minimum wage number and a reasonable minimum wage escalation. I will tell you that whenever the advocates came out and moved the goalpost to $20 an hour, before we even had a conversation about what was achievable, it certainly sent a signal to our members that perhaps there's not an interest in a serious conversation about what a new minimum wage could look like.
Senator, what's your working figure on the size of the quote-unquote surplus? And what do you see as the target for when you got a deal, the surplus will then be how much? More than zero, right?
Well, I think one of the things that's a big challenge in the way we work with our budgets is that our caucus has always viewed the budget as a multi-year conversation. Even though we're passing a 12-month budget, we're always very focused on what the out years may look like. Because as we've said time and again, the surplus we have, the rainy day fund we have, while it's healthy and while we are in the best fiscal position we have been in since the late 90s, those are one-time dollars. And as I talked about a little earlier, the inflationary pressures are real. And so I don't know that we have a specific number, but what we look at is every dollar of spend that is put into an initiative translates into recurring expenses because that becomes the new expectation. And so our efforts over the 3-year look ahead, as difficult as that is to make sure that we do not get into a negative balance within that time frame. And that's really our objective, because I think in our mind a 3-year window is kind of the most reasonable window that we can look at and try to make projections with some degree of certainty.
So then for the first year, right now, you got a decision to make in the coming weeks. What is that number in your mind? 3 billion, 5 billion?
Well, I would say, well, again, to me, there's not only the question of spend, but recurring spend. Obviously, let's, for argument's sake, say we do exactly what the governor proposed in his budget. That 3 billion this year becomes 6 billion next year, becomes 9 billion the following year, and then we are then very, very quickly upside down. And so that's the key balance. We don't have a fixed number in mind. Quite frankly, what our focus is on maintaining expectations, maintaining a reasonable growth of spending that allows us to be able to make sure that the taxpayer is protected in the long run.
Senator, I was wondering, along those same lines, I mean, you've called for a $2.9 billion, I think it's $2.9 billion tax cut. Okay, so where do you see the spend number going? I mean, is it the governor's number and then taking the $3 billion away, dollars away to balance or dip into how are you doing it?
Well, our view on the tax cut, I think we made very clear in the beginning of May. If the policy decision in this building is that we have too much money in our bank account, then we have to recognize who gave it to us in the first place, and that's the taxpayer. We fundamentally believe, when you look at the fastest growing age demographic in this Commonwealth, which is 85 plus, that tells us we have to do something new, bold, and different. And that's why when you look at a personal income tax cut, when you look at the elimination of the gross receipts tax, what are we doing in that case? We are eliminating one of the most regressive taxes in this Commonwealth. We are reducing taxes not only on small employers, but on individuals, and keeping in mind that the personal income tax is not just paid on income that is earned, but also investments and savings. So we think that that's a dynamic shift and a dynamic change that actually helps grow our economy and bolster our treasury. Having said that, we fully understand that the House Democrats in particular are not necessarily enamored with that. That comes at no surprise to us. And so that conversation will continue in terms of what's acceptable not only on the tax side of the equation, but the spend side of the equation.
So what do you consider a reasonable increase?
In spending? Well, if you look at the rate of inflation, obviously inflation is pushing a lot. I don't stand here to reflect a specific number because quite frankly, my definition of reasonable is not the same as the 27 other members of our caucus. My definition of reasonable is what gets 26, 102, and 1 while making sure we're not exposing ourselves to a fiscal cliff in the years ahead.
I have one more question. At what point do you see this being the Senate putting out its budget and leaving town, as we've seen happen in the past?
Well, I don't see a scenario like that this year. I don't see us just sending over a budget and leaving town. I will tell you that invariably, if negotiations don't go well, that could be a scenario that unfolds. But I'm still optimistic and hopeful that while progress hasn't been made to the extent that I would like at this point, there is still time to get this accomplished and get it accomplished, if not on June 30th, hopefully in early July before any meaningful impacts to everyday Pennsylvanians occur.
Does the recent court decision on Act 40 make you more comfortable with potentially boosting funding for public transit as the governor has proposed?
Absolutely.
To the tune of how much?
Well, there again, I don't know how you peg arbitrary numbers at this point. I will say that the request of $283 million I don't think is achievable. But I will also add that Act 40, which was done on a very bipartisan basis, I think is absolutely critical to any conversation about funding support of SEPTA. Because at the end of the day, I don't care how much money you put into a transit system, if the people do not feel safe to use that network, then what's the point? And Act 40 was all about ensuring the safety of the ridership of SEPTA, because obviously it's become very clear that the District Attorney of Philadelphia has other priorities.
With regard to Grove, Pennsylvania, how hard is your caucus? Is that like a firm, definitely want that in this week?
I think higher education is one of the pieces that is perhaps most achievable in this conversation. As I've said before, I give the governor immense credit for recognizing the crisis that's in front of us on higher ed. We have disagreements on the approach that he put forward during his budget address, but nevertheless, it's a conversation that needs to occur. Scott Martin and Ryan Ament and Senator Argel have in particular been leaders in this higher education conversation. Obviously, we're biased. We think that the package that we sent to the House is perfect. We think that it should be approved and signed by the governor without change, but we're certainly open to conversation on what that could look like, because we do think the fundamental issue remains and we have to figure out how to address it.
Not to hog the conversation, but have any of the constitutional amendments come into play in your talks? Voter ID, statute of limitations, is that part of the conversation?
No, because our message on those issues has been consistent for the last 18 months.
So you don't see any movement on those?
Unless our friends in the House see things our way, no.
Would you rule out your caucus's support for a budget that includes no tax cuts of any kinds? In other words, do you expect some tax cut, or are you demanding a tax cut?
Well, I think we have to do something within the world of taxation to be dynamic in encouraging growth and investment. What that could look like could mean many things. Obviously, the net operating loss carry forward issue is a big issue. We think that that would be very important in enhancing growth within small businesses. The conversation around the corporate net income tax, I don't know that accelerating that cut is feasible, but we certainly want to keep that on schedule. Those are things that we're certainly open to a conversation on. Obviously, we think that reducing the personal income tax has a lot of value, but we recognize that there are others in this building that think otherwise.
Beyond the level of education funding the Democrats asked for, they also asked for an adequacy formula to distribute it among public schools. That would be something that hasn't been used before. How has that played with your colleagues?
Well, that's a difficult conversation, and I will say this, whether it's the adequacy formula or the BEF formula or any formula, The real challenge, in my opinion, that we have in this Commonwealth is that we have 500 school districts, and each and every one of them have a different definition of what's fair. That's the ultimate challenge. And so we're trying to thread a needle in driving out dollars in a fair formula that addresses the unique circumstances of every school district in this Commonwealth. So whether it's adequacy, BEF, whatever you want to call it, I think the challenge beyond the raw number, whatever number we put into a program or an initiative, driving those dollars out to recognize fairness is the key. For example, I come from a district where every one of my districts has a declining enrollment. And if you look statewide, our enrollment is declining statewide. We have the smallest kindergarten class enrolled right now since 1986. And so we are consistently putting more dollars into public education while educating fewer students. Now, I recognize, because of the declining enrollment in the district I represent, that just because you're educating fewer students doesn't mean your overall costs go down. But there's so many dynamics as it relates to growing districts versus districts with declining enrollment, with local tax effort, and with all of those elements, special education, that it's really hard to figure out how to meet the standard of fair 500 different ways.
Do you believe that the budget deal will include some sort of regulation of games of skill? And what would that look like?
I think it should. I don't think regulating games of skill is contingent upon a budget being achieved, but at this point in time, I am very concerned that not regulating the games of skills is becoming a public safety crisis. The parlors that we see opening up are essentially mini casinos that are unregulated, untaxed, not secure, and I think that we're sitting on a public safety powder keg if we don't address them.
Senator, I would like to hire it. The governor's, or one of the Democratic bills has called for, I think the exact wording is a board of higher education. The makeup of that is different than what's outlined by one of those Grove PA bills, might be Senator Argo's bill. It's a task force of some sort. Can you talk about your thoughts on a group of leaders in this state who will plot the future of higher ed, so to speak, what it should be?
You know, that's a really good question, and it's really where I felt the governor's proposal was flawed whenever he presented it in February, which was bringing the community colleges and the state system together. And as he said in his budget address, one entity was losing 30% of its enrollment, another lost 37% of its enrollment. I was hard-pressed to understand how bringing those two entities together made them better. But beyond that, when you look at Penn State and the obvious challenges they're having with their branch campuses, Pitt obviously has a smaller branch campus network, but then we also have the private schools, which educate about 275,000 students in this Commonwealth. We have a very dynamic network of higher educational opportunities, and I don't think we can have a conversation about higher education reform in a silo. We own the state system. Obviously, the state relateds are just that, related to us, and then, of course, we have the private network. The thought leaders in all of those subsets of higher ed have to come together and have to recognize barriers need to be brought down because they all have the same common problem. What I'm concerned about is developing another layer of bureaucracy that wouldn't necessarily be helpful to the solution.
I had a question, Senator, on pharmacy benefit managers. There seems to be bipartisan support for regulations on that industry. Do you see anything coming together this month on that issue?
I'm very hopeful. We are working very hard to achieve something on PBMs. As you said, it's bipartisan. I was glad to see the governor bring that topic up in his budget address in February. Coming from a rural community, I understand the value and importance of independent pharmacies. In particular, I'm very concerned about big pharma. I'm very concerned about PBMs and what they're doing to the detriment primarily of rural communities. And so I'm hopeful that that is one of the pieces that we can land in the next week or so. But I will tell you, it's extraordinarily complex.
When was the most recent time you spoke with the governor about the budget?
I just talked to him 2 days ago.
What was, can you tell us the nature of that?
It was just a very general, cordial conversation. He offered a willingness to remain engaged as he has been, and I indicated to him that I thought we were moving along, but that we could perhaps use a little more of a kick in the pants to get moving. We're in constant contact with his staff on a very regular basis, and so the conversations have been productive.
I think you've talked about school funding, the inflationary demands on healthcare, social services, anything else that is soaking up a lot of time and budget?
Education and human services are significant pieces of the conversation that drive the spend number.
Anything else taking a lot of time?
I mean, those are the most significant. The transit piece has been around. What I will say about transit is we have historically never done anything on transit without also doing transportation infrastructure. And so I've been very clear that if we're going to do those two, that they have to be done in tandem. I'm hard pressed to figure out where that revenue stream comes from, other than one, finally getting electric vehicles to pay their fair share, which is a very modest number. But I do think the regulation of the games of skill opens a door to having a conversation about doing something for transit and transportation infrastructure.
Is there a number you're toying with on games of skill?
Well, it's one of the very most difficult things to predict because, frankly, we have no sense of where these games are, how many they are, and it's really the Wild West right now. And that, I think, is what makes the conversation around regulating games of skill very interesting, because it's actually a gaming contraction conversation. We're not expanding gaming because, whether we like it or not, these things have showed up at our doorsteps. The courts have given them a degree of validity, and I believe we have an obligation to put a framework around them. Obviously, revenue comes as part of that, and I think that revenue can help us unlock a couple of those other conversations. But again, that's not wed to the success of the budget, although I will say that if we don't get our arms around this in the next couple of weeks, I don't know how we ever really functionally revisit the topic.
Looking at economic development, I know one thing was 500 million bonds for PA sites. Is that anything that's come back up?
Personally, I'm not a fan of the bonding conversation. Obviously, we do have a surplus, a rainy day fund. We need to be careful about that. But I don't know that adding bonding into the mix is overly helpful. But more importantly to that is our caucus has had a priority on permitting reform. There's, in my mind, no value in putting significant dollars in building sites for economic development if we can't get the shovels in the ground to make the work happen. And it's no secret that this Commonwealth's quite challenged in being efficient on issuing permits to unlock economic development. I appreciate the governor's work administratively to do what he can to help improve that process, but legislatively, we have worked in a bipartisan way. It's one of the examples where the business community and the labor community came together. We passed comprehensive permitting reform led by Senator Phillips Hill over to the House in a bipartisan way, and I'm hard-pressed to see how we make an economic development investment of that magnitude without permitting reform.
Is there any chance that election law will be part of any package that passes in the next few weeks?
If the House chooses to put voter identification on the ballot, there could be.
One or two more questions.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay. The House Democrats last week actually, brought a bill in committee, approved it along party lines, and put it on the House floor on the same week that would prohibit credit card and swipe fees from being applied to the sales tax. Is this something that House Democrats has brought to you? Is something that they want to see on the table going into a negotiation?
There's a lot of spin and swirl on that issue, but it's certainly not something I've seen rise to the level of a conversation where anything would happen in the next couple weeks.
If I could just are you saying that your caucus is looking at using any money from a taxation on games and skills specifically dedicating that to transportation or transit?
Well, I think the challenge that we have with games of skills is that we have no reasonable way to predict the revenue that could come in because we have no real sense of the machines that are out there. We have no real sense of the utilization that would occur if we were to regulate them and bring parameters around them. My sense is that those dollars should go into the general fund given the unknown. However, generally, if we do not have revenue streams to offset what's been asked of us for transit, I don't see how we get there. Because keep in mind, the transit conversation is about us dedicating a certain portion of the sales tax for transit. That's obviously a revenue loss. And when you compound that by my point of view that we're not doing transit without infrastructure, then we have to figure out additional offsets for revenue to accommodate that. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm not talking about the transfer to the motor license fund, because in my opinion, the motor license fund transfers, as we continue to get the state police out of the motor license fund, need to continue. Frankly, all that's doing is righting a wrong of years past, and it barely keeps up, I think, with the inflationary pressures we're seeing on infrastructure projects.
Last week you approved the structured literacy program, and I think it was Senator Williams who made the comment that any funding that's put into education, additional funding, it should be like there should be a demand that some money goes to funding that program that can cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that something that you're
I certainly think, obviously, literacy is the fundamental building block to any opportunity for educational growth and opportunity. And whatever we can do to try to enhance literacy opportunities for our students, we certainly should do that.
What are the human services pieces that are tying up is it home health care, is it the IDA?
Well, all of the human service pieces are challenging to meet the demand. The intellectual disabilities piece, the nursing home piece, the home health piece are all massive pieces in that conversation. Okay, one last one.
What do you need to do to actually light a fire and get going? If you're not going the speed you want right now, how does that increase?
Coming to people like you. All right? Thank you.
Hopper,
Have a good